Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to build the massive, invisible machine of macroeconomics. We'll start from its absolute most basic parts and work our way up to a continuous, self-sustaining circular system. It's going to be a fun ride.
Here's the blueprint for our explainer today. We're going to cover 1. The paradox of national wealth, 2. The anatomy of economic goods, 3. Gauging it all with stocks versus flows, 4. The circular flow of income, and finally, number 5, why economists build models. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The paradox of national wealth, uncovering the secret to prosperity.
Okay, let's dive right in by confronting a massive, glaring contradiction in global wealth. Why are some of the most heavily resource-rich countries among the absolute poorest in the world? We tend to just assume that natural resources equal wealth, right? But if that were actually true, regions overflowing with resources like parts of Africa and Latin America wouldn't be home to some of the poorest nations on Earth. And at the exact same time, you have incredibly prosperous nations with practically zero natural wealth. It's a striking paradox, and it really forces us to rethink what actually makes a nation prosperous.
Well, early pioneers like Adam Smith figured out pretty quickly that wealth isn't just what you happen to have buried in the ground. Wealth is generated by transforming those resources through a continuous flow of production. Just like this quote points out, having resources isn't enough. People actually have to combine their energy with their environment, using a technological structure to create real value. So wealth, it's an action. It's not just a possession.
Moving on to Section 2. The anatomy of economic goods, categorizing the parts of our machine.
To really understand this flow of production, we have to look at the individual parts. And what's absolutely fascinating here is how the exact same item, let's take tea leaves for example, can change its classification entirely based on its economic behavior. Take a look at this. On the left, when you brew tea at home, it's a final good. It literally drops out of the active economic flow because you consume it. But look on the right. If a restaurant brews those exact same leaves to sell a cup of tea to a customer, boom, those leaves become an intermediate good. They're now a raw material input for further economic value addition. So it's not the physical nature of the good itself, but the economic nature of how it's used that defines it. Pretty wild, right?
Now, beyond everyday consumer items, we have what are called capital goods. Think of these as the vital backbone of any production process. They continually enable cycles of production. We're talking about heavy machines, factory buildings, tools, the whole shebang. They don't just get completely consumed or transformed right away like raw cotton or those tea leaves we just talked about. Instead, they stick around, basically making the continuous creation of other commodities feasible.
So here's the crucial point to keep in mind. When we're measuring the massive output of an entire economy, we literally only count the final goods. Why? To avoid massively exaggerating our economic activity. Think about it for a second. The final price of a cotton shirt already includes the value of the raw cotton and the yarn used to make it. If we added up the raw cotton, and then the yarn, and then the final shirt all together, we'd be double counting. Our economic machine would look artificially huge and completely distorted.
That brings us to Section 3. Gauging it. Stocks versus flows. Measuring the machine's performance.
Okay, before we can see this whole macroeconomic machine run, we have to know how to read its gauges. Imagine a water tank being filled from a tap. The water pouring in per minute is a flow, because it's measured over a specific period of time. In economics, things like income, output, or profits are kind of meaningless unless you attach a time period to them. If I tell you a factory produces 1,000 cars, that doesn't really tell you much, does it? 1,000 cars a day? 1,000 cars a decade? That time element is what defines a flow.
Conversely, if you measured the total amount of water sitting in that tank right at this very second, you are measuring a stock. A stock exists completely independent of a specific time period. It simply represents what is there at a frozen, exact point in time.
Applying this to the real world makes the difference crystal clear. For example, your annual salary, that's a flow. But the actual factory buildings and machines existing today, that represents an economy's capital stock. The new machines you add this year are a flow. They're pouring into the tank. But the total accumulation of all the machines you've gathered over the years, that's your stock.
Let's see how these gauges track actual economic growth by accounting for depreciation. Now, depreciation is basically the inevitable wear and tear on our machine's parts. Every single year, machines break down, they get old, they need replacing. So if we take our gross investment, which is all the brand new capital goods produced, and we subtract that annual depreciation, we are left with net investment. And this net number is absolutely crucial because it's what actually grows the economy's capital stock.
All right, Section 4, the circular flow of income, the engine in motion.
Now that we've got all our parts and gauges defined, let's zoom out. Let's watch this entire macroeconomic engine run in a closed loop. In our simplified economy, households provide 4 fundamental resources to firms, and in return, they receive 4 specific types of income. Check this out. If you provide human labor, you get a wage. If you provide capital, you earn interest. Entrepreneurship gets you profit, and land gets you rent. This exchange right here creates the very foundation of the economic cycle.
So, mentally drawing the top half of our engine, the goods market, we see households sending money to firms, and finished commodities flowing right back into the hands of those households. Basically, households take the wages and profits they just earned, and they spend them entirely on the goods and services that the firms are churning out.
Then, to complete the circle in the factors market down below, households supply the labor and resources while firms pump wages and profits right back to them. The firms are taking the sales revenue they just earned from the top loop and using it to pay the households for their labor and resources in the bottom loop.
The big takeaway here? The aggregate spending of the economy perfectly equals the aggregate income earned by the factors of production. In this model, there are no leakages, no savings hidden under a mattress somewhere, no taxes, no imported goods. The money simply circulates endlessly, enabling this continuous, non-stop creation and consumption of wealth.
Which brings us to our final section, number 5, why economists build models. Simplifying complexity to find truth.
Now, you might be wondering, since real life obviously involves taxes and savings and international trade, why do economists even bother building these stripped-down circular flow models in the first place? Well, they use these simplified blueprints because they expose the fundamental mechanics of how an economic system behaves as a whole. A model isn't supposed to map every single minute detail of reality. Instead, by stripping away the distractions, we can highlight the essential features and finally uncover the underlying truths of the system.
And this leads us to a really profound macroeconomic paradox. Think about it. An individual household cannot magically raise its own income simply by spending more, right? If a single worker decides to start spending wildly beyond their means, their boss doesn't just automatically hand them a raise. But what happens when an entire economy tries to do it? When we look at the economy as a whole system through our model, the rules completely change.
Because income moves in a circular loop. Increased collective spending literally forces firms to produce more, which inherently generates the exact additional income needed to fund that spending. The macroeconomic machine operates on entirely different rules than we do as individuals. If households collectively decide to spend more, firms must increase production to meet that demand. And to increase production, they have to pay out more wages and profits. So the very act of the economy's spending more inherently generates the exact income needed to sustain it. It is a brilliant, totally counterintuitive truth revealed by our model, which leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder. If an economy's income is only limited by its own collective willingness to spend and produce, what truly represents the ultimate ceiling of a nation's prosperity?